Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here.
All right.
So I've been saying I'm looking forward to the coming 5 months and the years thereafter with Gary Johnson, and I'm looking forward to taking strong positions and sticking with them. I think that's what we've got to do. Move the needle. And moving the needle in politics isn't always easy, and you got to stick to your guns, and I think Gary and I have the track record to prove that we're going to be able to do that. In fact, it so happens that I have a long history in my life of taking strong positions, pushing them, seeing them come to fruition, sometimes years ahead of my time, sometimes as much as a decade. When I joined the Justice Department under President Reagan, every U.S. attorney, every federal prosecutor had to choose a top priority in their state. I chose public corruption. I was the only one out of 94 U.S. attorneys to say that public corruption was the #1 problem in my state. But it was. The same party had been in power for 50 years. I don't care what party it is. If they're in power for 50 years, they're going to be corrupt. So I took them on. I filed 111 public corruption cases in my 5 years as U.S. Attorney in Massachusetts. I got convictions. That's not the punchline. The punchline is I got convictions in 110 out of 111. Even my good friend Rudy Giuliani in New York couldn't touch that percentage record of convictions. And now public corruption is absolutely at the top of the Justice Department's agenda, and it has been ever since I went down to Washington as head of the criminal division of the Justice Department. I got promoted from local guy to national guy, and I made public corruption our #1 down there, and I don't think it's ever left the top of the Justice Department's agenda since then. But that came out of one district. It's an example of the states being laboratories of democracy, trying something out in one state that then goes viral and goes national. In terms of prosecution of banks for not living up to their obligations to report cash transactions, which is very important in the prosecution of narcotics and organized crime cases, the big international cartels, because those guys, they don't like to get around the massive amounts of material they're trafficking in, but they won't get far from the cash. So if the banks don't file these reports, it's very hard to bring those cases. So in 1985 was the breakthrough year there, and there were 6 big cases filed against banks for basically failing to report cash, and it was a form of fraud. It came to be called money laundering, or it was an aid of money laundering. Guess how many of those cases, those 6 cases, were filed in my district in Massachusetts? The answer is all 6 of them. Okay? So Congress gets very interested when it sees that. And one was the Bank of Boston, and one was the Bank of New England. These were not fly-by-night little banks. And the Bank of New England went to trial, and the briefs in that case were the national textbooks on corporate criminal liability. Broke new law, made a lot of law. Those were trailblazing prosecutions. So Congress got interested. This was a national and international problem. And Bill Roth, who is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, asked me to come down and testify about this, which I did, and it resulted in the federal anti-money laundering legislation of 1986, which is landmark legislation and stays on the books to this day. So that was another instance of starting in Massachusetts, and it wound up as national policy in Washington. Thank you. In terms of organized crime, La Cosa Nostra had a grip on matters in New England for years and years and years before I got into office. We did a very complicated, long-running investigation, indicted the top 3 echelons of organized crime, La Cosa Nostra in New England, wiped out all 3 levels. La Cosa Nostra in New England has never recovered to this day, which is 20 years later. My personal favorite category of cases that I filed when I was U.S. Attorney was not all that numerous, but it was an impact class. It involved phony disability pensions. If somebody in the city of Boston had a beef with the mayor and had to go, what was the exit? The exit was the guy would come into his doctor and say, I had a slip and fall, my neck is killing me, I'm wearing a Thomas collar, or I was in a terrible auto crash and my spine is injured. So they would go see complacent docs who would say, yeah, this guy's in real trouble. So they would get a disability pension worth $30,000, $35,000 a year. And it was with a 30-year life expectancy. These people were in the prime of health, in the prime of their lives. They just had a political golden exit. So those disability pensions were worth $1 million apiece. And it was a time-honored tradition in the city of Boston. And it completely outraged me. So I called in the U.S. Postal Service, which actually has very good investigative and inspection services, and they followed these guys around on weekends and saw them, jumping around and nailing a new roof on their house, and it was just obvious that they were lying. And we prosecuted these guys. All three of them went to trial. They all said, this is a matter of essentially local concern, butt out. You don't even have jurisdiction. Well, they all three got convicted, and they got pretty long sentences too, because the judge thought this was emblematic of a real problem. But the kicker here is that the next year, the number of disability pensions applied for in the city of Boston went down by 87%. So that's an indication of how long people have been stealing from the taxpayers with impunity. And again, it was a small number of cases, but it was an impact initiative. When I became governor, the state budget was $14 billion. The state was, this is January of '91. I immediately followed Governor Dukakis, who was a three-term Democrat. There was a $2 billion hole in the budget out of $14 billion. Everyone said, no, you can't plug that gap. I said, oh, I think I can cut $2 billion in fat out of this budget in short order. Governor Dukakis said, Billy Weld's a nice enough boy. We used to be in the same law firm, but he just doesn't understand anything. There's no fat to cut out. We've already cut through nerve. We've cut through muscle. And now what he's proposing is to cut into the bone marrow. That's what he wants to do. So I took office on January 3rd. I had to file my first budget on February 28th. Between January 3rd and February 28th, we identified $2 billion, 14% of the budget, in cuts, and submitted a balanced budget on February 28th, okay? In the teeth of unified opposition. The next thing I noticed was that the state workforce was a lot bigger than it needed to be. It was 72,000 people. We did an analysis of the workforce needs of all the services that we felt the government had a duty to deliver, and we were left over with 8,000 state employees who it seemed to us were completely unnecessary. So I furloughed them all on day one of my administration. I cut 8,000 people off the payroll on day one. They stayed off, and in 2 terms, I never got so much as a postcard saying, where is that essential state employee that you furloughed back in January of 1991? Again, they said it couldn't be done. Well, what you do when people tell you it can't be done is to do it. And then you say, well, I just did it. And that's the way you have to do things in politics sometimes. In terms of policy initiatives, again, I kind of trod where no one had trod before. I'd gotten to be very good friends with a good number of gays and lesbians during the campaign, and came out of the chute my first couple of months with a whole bunch of executive orders overturning existing state policy, which denied gays and lesbians visitation rights, bereavement rights. I mean, it was atrocious what the legal position to be gay or lesbian in Massachusetts in 1991 was. So I repealed that, rolled it back. These to me seem very minor steps. It was a national firestorm. People said, you can't do this, you're overturning the order. This is for the legislature. These are societal judgments. You can't do that. And again, my response was, I just did. And that all held up. You know, no other governor touched that for the longest time. And I didn't care. But those policy steps all ripened into not just policy in other states, but into national policy as well. One of my proudest moments was to appoint Margaret Marshall to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. Margaret Marshall was a South African. I happen to know that she was head of the National Union of Students in South Africa, and I also happen to know that she had been expelled from the country by the apartheid regime in South Africa, and I thought that was a pretty good day's work, given what the apartheid regime in South Africa looked like. So she was a totally unknown South African who emigrated to the United States and was a good corporate litigator in a good Boston law firm, but no one would have looked twice at her. She's married to a liberal columnist for the New York Times, Tony Lewis, who is a personal hero of mine because his book, Gideon's Trumpet, about the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, sent me to law school. Anyway, I nominated Margaret Marshall to the Supreme Court to the great surprise of the press, which had predicted Margaret Marshall has 2 chances to be appointed to the Supreme Court, slim and none. Turned out they were wrong about that. She turned out to be a great Chief Justice, and I knew enough about how the international community worked to know that her being expelled from the country and keeping her head high meant that she had a degree of sand in her, as Huck Finn used to say of Mary Jane. She had more sand than any girl I ever knew, said Huck. He didn't know he was in love with Mary Jane, but he was. So I thought Margaret Marshall had sand. And she wound up writing the opinion holding that equality of marriage rights for gays and lesbians is constitutionally compelled under both the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of both the Massachusetts Constitution and the federal Constitution. The rest is history. That case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's where the whole thing started, in Massachusetts with my appointee. I take particular pride in that. In the area of education, it became clear to me that we had a problem with education, particularly in the inner cities, and that when people got to 12th grade, they were being given graduating diplomas, even if when they got to junior college, they immediately had to enroll in the remedial courses in both reading and mathematics because they weren't up to the job. So I said, okay, no more social promotions. Everyone said, you're the biggest racist in the history of Massachusetts because look where this hits. It hits in inner cities, minority youth, and you're just denying them their high school diploma and everybody else can sail on. So I said, no, I'm going to stick with this. And we put in high stakes, high standards, and then high stakes tests in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade. If you didn't pass those tests in 12th grade, you didn't go on from high school. Again, huge charges of racism. Okay, so at that point, Massachusetts ranked in the middle of the pack in terms of student performance. Starting 3 years after those tests went in, Massachusetts has ranked #1 in the United States in both reading and mathematics ever since. Another problem I noticed was welfare. The welfare rolls were enormous. 17% of the population, like some claim there. And it looked to me like we weren't taking advantage of a potential, which is tapping the workforce represented by these able-bodied welfare recipients. If they had kids in school, that's different. But so I put in a work requirement for welfare. If you want welfare benefits, courtesy of the taxpayers, we're going to find you a job. You don't have to find the job yourself, don't worry. But there's no substitute for work, I said. Not thinking about work, not looking for work, only work. And we have a lot of work that needs to get done. So again, taking a burden off the taxpayers, we made these jobs available, working in parks, schools, doing cleanup work, and those jobs were ready for anyone who wanted to apply for welfare. Well, guess what? The welfare rolls went down by 85% the next year also. There's an unlimited demand for anything that's free, right? So if you're a policymaker in the government, you have to think about that. That statute also, which we passed in '94, became the model for the Welfare Reform Act National, which President Clinton signed in 1996. Absolutely modeled, almost word for word, on our statute in 1994. In other policy initiatives, I think, again, I was kind of ahead of my time. I was the national chairman of U.S. term limits at a time when it was thought to be a fringe idea. You know, people back in the early 90s thought the taxpayers don't have a right to limit the size of their government. We can't have term limits because we'll then lose all this wisdom in the legislature. And, you know, we moved the needle there. We persuaded people that, well, you know, unfortunately they've not been persuaded in Washington, but that was something where I put my shoulder to the wheel at the national level. The same in terms of privatizing government functions, where that can be done to guarantee greater efficiency. Again, a savings for the taxpayer. So the two things I was national head of were U.S. term limits and the National Privatization Council. And I think both of those things are going to become national policy. They haven't yet, but I predict they're going to. So I was the first Republican governor elected in Massachusetts in 20 years. At the end of my first term, I was re-elected with 71% of the vote. Okay? Massachusetts was 3.5 to 1 Democratic. It was the most Democratic state in the Union, and we got 71% of the vote. After me, we had 4 Republican governors in a row. People kind of liked the dog food that they'd been served during the Weld-Cellucci years. So I guess the bottom line is, in public life, I have been an impact player, and I respectfully suggest to you that it's good to have an impact player on your side, and it's uncharacteristic of me to point out the things I've just pointed out, but my mother once said to me, "It ain't boasting if you've done it." Hope she's right. So I look forward to taking strong positions with Gary, if we're fortunate enough to get nominated and get into office. And if we're nominated, I promise you that I'm going to work as hard as I know how to raise all the money I know how to raise. And I've had a lot of experience there. I was the national finance chair for Pete Wilson when he ran for president, the governor of California, who had an enormous war chest. I was the New York co-chair for Mitt Romney when he ran for president, both in finance co-chair, both in 2008 and 2012. So I do know where some of the bodies are buried. And I do know that some of the big bodies that have not yet signed on with Mr. Trump harbor libertarian sympathies and points of view. So I'm absolutely going to work at that. I'm a libertarian now. I'm no longer a Republican. I'm going to work. So Gary and I are going to be working, as Gary has before, of course, to elect down-ballot libertarians to improve our numbers and our presentation nationwide. I do think that, and that will be a pleasure. You know, I did it as governor, and I'll do it as vice president, living so long and the creek don't rise. But it's going to be a great enterprise working together. I don't think we need that much luck. Gary and I need, of course, your support to be nominated, and we understand that. I'm here asking you for that support. I do think that if you need a crusader, and I think you do. I think we do. I think the party does. I think Gary Johnson and Bill Weld fit the bill as the kind of crusaders you need to represent you as we go forward. Thank you very much. To take questions if there is time, which I don't know. There's not time.
No, take it. Take questions.
Take questions. Okay. Yes, Chief.
Very well.
Yes, sir.
Big question. Is your significant other behind this?
She's behind me all the way. Leslie, where are you? Stand up. Wave. Isn't she beautiful? She is 1,000% behind us. She's driving Ron and Joe and everyone else crazy with Free legal advice. Other questions? Yes?
Governor Weld, you mentioned about your education stays that you did where you implemented testing to help raise the academic standards. Is that something you're pushing on for a national platform then in order to get
Oh no, oh no. I want the national government out of the education business. I honestly think, and I think Gary does not disagree, the United States Department of Education, which was created as a payoff to the National Teachers Association after the 1976 Democratic Convention, should be abolished.
Yes.
At what?
At what level should education happen? Is it state level, community level, parents level? Like what level?
Well, I think there's a place for parents. You know, they say it takes a village to raise a child. What about parents, huh? That's an often forgotten level. It's a little bit more important. No, I'm happy with the states being the laboratories of democracy, and they can delegate as they see fit. But I'm just so much more comfortable at the state level. And I'm very much opposed to the current push for Common Core, which I think would dumb down our standards and the kids would know less about history and literature than under the current regime. I was also, and remain to this day, a strong proponent of charter schools. And I may say, it's an issue that should split the Democratic Party because they're on the wrong side of the issue and they know it. I testified probably 100 times before the Massachusetts legislature when I was governor. And the only time I had a following wind, i.e. a friendly audience behind me, was when I testified about charter schools. And I was faced by the House and Senate education chairs who were bought and paid for by the teachers' unions. And I said, well, this is outrageous. These schools are failing. Charter schools offer choice. The test scores are 3 times as high. We need more charter schools. And they said, reading from sheets, don't play the blame game with us, Mr. Weld. We're sick and tired of your blaming the teachers' union and playing the blame game. But they didn't dare look up because there were 350 faces behind me and not a one of them was white. Right? It's the inner city blacks and Latinos who knew that they were being deprived of educational opportunity because their schools stank.
Governor and Gary, you can chime in. You're not my first choice, but I want to support whoever comes out of here. Can you help land delegates here by addressing this? I'm a petitioner for the LP. We work our asses off to get on ballots. You've admitted you made a mistake with the Kasich ballot repression.
No. I had nothing to do with that. I knew nothing about Kasich.
What can you say to us so that we can feel good about Weld and Johnson now on getting LP ballot access?
Yeah, well, of course, now I'm a libertarian. So I have an incentive to work on LP ballot access. And I have said I would call Governor Kasich on it.
Gary, can you add on?
I think this is really valuable time. You know, we come together in this convention and there is no time to actually ask questions, and I don't see anything more valuable right now than to be asking some really hardball questions. I mean, if you've got the questions, ask them. But look, Bill Weld and myself running for President of the United States, I think the possibility... I don't mind being the lesser half of the ticket, okay? I don't mind. And as you've seen here, the lesser half of the ticket, okay, I'm okay with it. I'm comfortable in my own skin. But we have the opportunity here to achieve major party status. And what is that going to do for ballot access in the future? And you have worked your ass off. You worked your ass off, and we spent so much money and so much time, and all of you have done this for so long. To what end? Do we, I mean, to this end, to right now. More valuable than anything. Like I say, you're here, you got a chance. I mean, hardball. Go, here we go.
Okay, thank you, governors. Bill, you and I have had a couple of words on the floor, and I did come into this as a Johnson Weld supporter, and since talking to you a few times, I've backed off I need you to pull me back in. So my question is very simple. This will be the last question that I ask in public. I would love an opportunity to talk to you privately. The question is, what is the difference between a Democrat and a Republican? And more importantly, what is the difference between a Republican and a Libertarian?
Well, in my book, the Democrats are off base on economic issues, and the Republicans are off base on social issues. And the difference between a Republican today, not 25 years ago, but today, and a Libertarian is that the Republican Party is in the grip of movement conservatives who believe that who believe in an anti-choice position on abortion, that should not be left to a woman and her doctor, which I find anathema. They're very resistant to the idea that people who happen to have gay or lesbian sexual orientation should have the same right to get married and live happily ever after as people who have heterosexual orientation. I just find that unfathomable. You heard about my pride in appointing the woman who wrote the opinion. You heard about my pride in being the national leader on this in the early 90s. So there's a huge difference between the two parties. Each of them is 50% wrong, and they're wrong on the different half. And it's becoming increasingly clear to me with every day that there's a huge difference between the Libertarian Party, which in my book is right about everything, and the Republican Party, which is wrong on 50% of the issues.
Question? Oh,
Michelle.
Yes, thank you so much. I have a question. There's been over 15 million homes and counting daily taken back by the banks, and I'm not going to go into the gory details of it. But what would a Johnson, I'm sorry, well, I'm sorry, sir, I've met so many people this week.
You should remember my name because you inspired my remarks with our chat at 11 o'clock this morning.
Well, sir, I know you by first name. I forgot your last name.
That's how folksy I am.
What would your administration do? And this is critical to the Bernie folks. What would your administration do about this problem to restore justice to the American homeowners in this country?
Let me leap at that one. As I was starting to say to you, we were sitting with my wife at the table. I ain't no big fan of banks. The more light that gets shed on the practices that led to the collapse in 2000, 2008, I think the less good the banks look. And I'm talking not just the investment banks, which played at this level, but commercial banks as well. So I want to take a real good look at banking practices and how they are impacting unfairly on, frankly, consumers who don't have equal bargaining power. And they get sent a 20-page thing to sign, and they don't really understand that in year 4, X, Y, and Z can happen, but then the banks come in with all this favorable legislation saying the bank always wins, and it's beginning to turn my stomach.
thank you. And Gary, thanks for recruiting Governor Weld, and Governor Weld, thanks for coming forward to be a champion for the cause of liberty. So, but my heartfelt question for you is, and perhaps you could just dispel a rumor. On the same day I learned that you were being rumored as Gary's running mate was the same day I read that Mitt Romney said he was giving up on seeking a third-party bid. It would not be unreasonable for you to be in touch with Mitt Romney. He said you were his campaign chair. Has there been some kind of back-channel coordination between you and the Romney folks that you are the Never Trump movement and you're kind of carrying their water?
Oh no, I haven't spoken to Mitt in probably 9 months. I hadn't realized he had said finally that he would not file himself. I must have missed that in all the hue and cry.
Thank you.
So do you think that was a mistake? I mean, this is what this brings to the ticket. All that talk, and this was a conjecture on my part that would actually take place. And I didn't realize that Romney had categorically taken himself out of this. But that's what came to an end. All this third-party talk came to an end. And when Bill came on board, I hope I don't need to point this out. He got more publicity than any libertarian over a 2-day period than any libertarian has gotten. And wouldn't we like, look, you as hardcore big L's, You don't agree with Johnson, you don't agree with Weld, but how about instead of having the meeting in the clubhouse, in the treehouse, how about having the meeting in the auditorium, because there are going to be thousands of people that are going to show up, and you're going to be able to make the pitch that these are not the ideal guys. These are not the ideal guys. Here's what the ideal guys are. All the way down the ticket, growing the ticket. I heard Bill say that, and it's true. This will grow the ticket. This will bring candidates out of the woodwork. People, this is the end of the Republican Party, in my opinion.
I'll just point out that it took 6 years for the Whigs to disappear, the dominant national party between 1846 and 1852.
The only party in the country that's worse on gun rights than the Republicans are the Democrats. They're all so bad. Mr. Weld, where do you stand on gun rights right now?
I would not support any bill to outlaw classes of weapons unless it was a gun that could fire a tactical nuclear weapon. And I had occasion to resist a lot of calls for expanding background checks en masse. I'm familiar with abuses at the police chief level. I was talking with a delegate yesterday who made the interesting suggestion that power, to the extent it needs to exist, could be at the county level instead. I've been a lifelong hunter. I had my first 410 when I was 10 years old, my first 20 gauge when I was 14, my first 12 gauge 2 years later. I have a nice collection of guns that I hope nobody ever forces me to use. Thank you.
Bill got to point out earlier, on a point of privilege, Leslie, who I've gotten to meet and is terrific. I would like you all to recognize Kate Prusak, my other half. Kate, this wouldn't be happening without Kate. Thank you. Yeah.
So, governors, your pitch right now is essentially asking the party, it's a pragmatic versus purist deal. You're asking us that you're going to get all this. I'll be honest with you, Governor Weld, you have not done yourself any favors in the debates here. You've actually, personal conversations, you've lost more votes than you've gained. So what can you do to assure us that we're not making a devil's bargain here by, sacrificing a little now that we'll gain more later, that we're going to have, 40, 45 state ballot access and 5, 10, maybe even a White House 6 months from now? What's that last little bit that you can assure some of the more, hardcore libertarians, some of the people who want a real purist, hardcore message ticket, that it's okay, that you guys, be perfectly honest, you're not anarchists, you're probably an anarchist, maybe even a little back from that. What can you say to make those delegates that are on more that half of the party more comfortable voting for you and not feeling like they're compromising and not putting forth the ticket that they would fully support? What is something you can say, something you can do? Because you're not doing yourself any favors right now, as far as I can see.
I'm not sure I would buy your premise that we're asserting impurity and that we're saying, yeah, impurity is a good thing. Forget libertarian positions. Quite the contrary. So I'm not there with you on your premise. I would point out that although Gary was booed by a small number of people when he said Bill Weld's a real libertarian, this is on the first night when there was both a presidential debate, which I attended, and vice presidential debate, in which I participated. We did win the straw polls after both of those debates. Okay? Yeah.
Sir, I'm part of the Radical Caucus, and one of my major issues is war. And I just haven't heard much about war, anti-war, and so where are your two stances on war? How would you handle the Middle East and the problems of war?
We're together on that, Gary.
Well, look, how about a couple of, and it's one thing to talk about philosophy, and it's important, it's really important, and that's the party, and that's the Libertarian Party, and that's the basis. And then it's another thing to actually govern. And what you got here are a couple of guys who served in deeply blue states as Republicans and got reelected by bigger margins the second time than the first time by being small government guys, first and foremost. And so why, you've heard this before, why did Rand Paul, who was libertarian, why did he fail so miserably? He failed because he's not libertarian, he's Republican. That's why he failed. And so he failed because he started to toe this line on foreign policy. And the line needs to be that a couple of guys need to be at the table as skeptics and say, look, let's stop with these military interventions, that they have an unintended consequence of making things worse, not better. That's where we're sitting at the table. This is where we're coming at it from. Let's stop with the military interventions, boots on the ground, dropping bombs, flying drones that are killing thousands of innocent people. The fact that we have treaties with 69 countries throughout the world to defend their borders, and these were not congressionally authorized treaties. It goes on and on and on. Let's bring the troops home and let's make that happen. And that is libertarian, and that's what people want to hear, and that's why Rand Paul failed, because he wants to start to toe this line about being Republican as opposed to being libertarian. People are fed up with it.
The only thing we've heard about economic issues is the cutting of government, the veto. You know, that's an important part. But Bill, you said that the Republicans are mostly right on economic issues. I mean, it's a little bit about trimming around.
Compared to the Democrats.
So, but George Bush, you know, they all panicked when the time came for the bailouts, and John McCain came in there. So, where are they wrong?
No, that's right. I mean, under George W., who's a good friend of mine, and Barack Obama, we're going to have a $20 trillion debt by the time Obama leaves office. And the great majority of that, I forget exactly what the figure is, came under those two presidents, George W. and Barack Obama. And, you know, if we went back to a budget the size of what it was when Bill Clinton left office, we could probably operate the government on a, 10% tax rate. So these things are important. And, I often said in Massachusetts that my lack of experience in state government before I got elected was an advantage, because I didn't know that all these things in the budget were sacred cows. I didn't even know that they were cows. So when people came to me with a list of 100 reasons why you couldn't cut this and that, I said, boy, that's Greek to me. I don't understand that. And I did come to think that in government, the only way to cut spending is to cut spending, which means you have to dam the torpedoes and just go straight ahead. And you have to look at every account in the federal government or the state government, as the case may be, and do what's called zero basing each account. So you start the account at zero for the coming year, and it has to justify its existence. And it can't justify its existence by reference to inputs, i.e., what amount was in the account last year and spent by the government. It has to justify itself by reference to outcomes. This many patient outcomes in the healthcare area. This many jobs created here. This impact on the price of electricity. And when you do that, a lot of these programs don't stand up in a light wind.
Bill and I have talked at length, and Bill, it's possible to get elected President of the United States and Vice President of the United States. So in office, we would not have separate staffs. We would work together.
That would mean I would have no staff.
Right, exactly. His staff would be my staff.
Every step of the way.
And in that context, when Bill takes over as governor of Massachusetts, and on the first day in office, he furloughs 8,000 employees, I have the sense that what he brings to this equation is the ability to from the legalese and from all, there's so many pressures that come to bear. I have the sense that with the two of us working together on this, that there's going to be some really, really dramatic stuff that's going to take place. And I want you to know, we've got the experience that we've done this. We've actually done this to an extent that no other governors have done this. and as President, Vice President of the United States, that we will do the things that everybody's been talking about all this time, and it's libertarian. It's libertarian. I mean, I always took it as a badge of honor that people describe me as a libertarian. 3 months into office, there was a headline in the Albuquerque Journal that said, Gary Johnson is not a Republican, he's a libertarian. And I viewed that as a badge of honor, and I think Bill would say the same thing, always. I held Bill up as this model of here's who I want to grow up and be.
Got some weight to gain.
Governor Johnson, I support your call to bring the troops home completely. But once the troops are brought home, what do we do about the CIA's secret work inside the Middle East, which has been going on since they overthrew Mossadegh in 1953?
Now, I'm just going to tell you, okay? I would basically kind of mumble along, and I would say, yeah, we need to do something about that. But you know what? I have this sense that this guy can answer this question a little bit better than me.
Either one.
Yeah. No, I'll bet he can.
Well, that was my great-uncle-in-law, Kermit Roosevelt, who in 1953 came out of Groton and Harvard with a little walking around money in his pockets and engineered the Mossadegh overthrow. So I guess maybe I'm a bad person to ask. But when I was head of the criminal division, I had both the CIA and the FBI reporting to me on their operations, because there had to be one federally, presidentially appointed person in charge in case something went wrong. So I used to know a lot about that world. I'm not current now, but as you doubtless know from the depth of knowledge displayed by your question, I mean, it's an intricate internecine web of just all the intelligence services in the world gathered in the Middle East. It's like a heart beating. It's got to stop. And you know, the Middle East, it's a tragedy that the passions run so high as they do, not only Israel and those challenging Israel's right to exist, but also Sufi and Sunni. I'm a member of a group of former world leaders. Everyone except me is a head of state, and I'm only there because they made me an associate member because Bill Clinton is the U.S. nominee, and he's often too busy to attend. They want to have an American at the table to talk to, so I probably know more about this than I might. But the Sunni Shia fight is considered to be possibly the most dangerous one-on-one form of religious sectarianism in the world, and of course ISIS and radical Islam would be right there as well. But there are enemies, and so we have to keep our left hand high there. But the degree of involvement that we have all around the world, not just in the Middle East, bears some examination.
Could you clarify that in the context of free trade?
I hope I'm allowed to be a free trader. Gary, am I allowed to be a free trader?
Free trade, come on, free trade. Free trade versus a 35% tariff on imported goods into the United States. I mean, this is what we're up against. If this isn't a clear choice, I don't know where there could be more of a clear choice. And Hillary's just going to muddle around on it. It's going to be fair trade as opposed to free trade.
Fair trade is not muddling around. That's saying we're in the tank for the unions and the enviros, and we don't want free trade. That's code for that.
So let's see, we'll have fair trade and we'll have protectionism. Protectionism. We'll all pay for a 35% tariff on all imported goods, and then we'll have the free traders. Look, the treaties that get signed, you know, this Trans-Pacific Trade Treaty, whatever it's called, I got to tell you, I'd be really, really skeptical of that. I don't think I would have signed it because I'll bet it's just laden with crony capitalism. I'll bet it's just laden with special interests.
Yes, with regards to free trade, one of the necessary conditions for free trade to thrive is global stability. And I'm wondering what your perspective is with respect to an argument that U.S. involvement in a variety of international organizations, as well as U.S. military presence overseas, like in Korea, for example, are a necessary condition to help ensure global stability.
If we're attacked, we're going to attack back. I mean, it's that simple. We're going to have an impenetrable national defense, but that's the argument. I mean, this is the argument that gets posed to politicians all the time. And how about presenting that argument to a couple of skeptics that at the very get-go, well, what interests and why? And at the end of the day, probably the argument isn't going to carry. That, from my standpoint, it's going to have to be an awfully convincing argument. But I get it. I get what you're saying. We provide this worldwide stability, and because of this worldwide stability, trade flourishes, and, well,
Governor Johnson, here's a practical matter. Could you give us a status on getting into the presidential debates, where we stand now?
Well, you got to be at 15% in the polls. We have a lawsuit going. Bruce Fein was here. Maybe many of you listened to him and the fact that he's heading up that lawsuit. You know, that there's a possibility that that prevails. But outside of that, let's assume that that doesn't happen timely and that you have to be at 15% in the polls. In 2012, I was not in one single national poll. In 2016, I've been in 3 national polls, 10%, 10%, 11%. But having appeared in those 3 polls, there have been another 30 polls conducted where my name hasn't been in there. And when I say my name, this was happening before Bill came on board. I think it's going to happen. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure here moving forward. I think one of the key milestones that we have to pass here is coming out of this convention with the nominations. And I recognize that that's not a done deal, but I think that's going to be really key. I think if that happens, I think there's a very real possibility that the names then are in these polls going forward. And very, very significant. Press passes in 2012, 20. Press passes 2016, 250. And all of us have worked for this. I mean, this is all of us having worked for this. So I want to respect everybody's time also. I know that I think we've probably gone over time. This was to end at noon. I'll just say it again. I respect every single one of you. This is us that have gotten in this position. It's us because you have worked so hard, tirelessly, so much money, so much time. If it doesn't happen now, it's just not going to happen. It's really not.
Thank you, everyone.